This week, we have a double portion, Tazria Metzora. And I'd like to just start by saying that there's also a logic that these two parshiot go together, because these two parshiot actually form a unit. The topic in both parshiot is what is known as Tuma Hayotzet Migufo Shel Adam, ritual purity, which is a result of something which comes out of the body of the person. And if you look at the structure of the two parshiot, and I'm just going to do this very briefly, the Parshat Tazria begins with ritual purity and impurity of a woman who gives birth. That's chapter 12. If we then go on to chapter 13, we have ritual purity of what is known as a Matsuura. And in fact, we talk about two types of ritual purity of Sarat: purity that's connected with the body of the person, and impurity, which is connected with the body of the person. And then afterwards, at the end of chapter 13, we discuss ritual impurity and the way of purification that has to do with the clothing of the individual, who is the clothing which has Sarat. In the second parsha, Parshat Metzora, chapter 14 begins with the whole process of purification of the person who has Sarat on his body. Subsequently, in that chapter, we discuss the idea of Sarat of houses. And then when we finish Parshat Metzora, we talk about 4 other situations of impurity. Zav, a man who has a seminal flow, which we could say is an expression of a certain sickness, maybe. Then it talks about Balkari, a man who just has a seminal emission. Then after that, we talk about Nida, a menstruating woman. And then the very last thing which we talk about in chapter 15 is Zava, which is a woman who bleeds in excess of her menstrual cycle. Now, if you look at it, it's really very interesting, because chapter 12 and chapter 15 are kind of bookends which speak about related topics. Okay, on the one hand, in chapter 12, the beginning, we speak about a woman giving birth with the different rules of impurity and purity, depending on whether it's a boy or a girl. In chapter 15, we talk about ritual impurity, which is connected with one's sexual organs, whether it be a man or a woman. In the case of a man, a result of some type of seminal emission. In the case of woman, bleeding. And in the middle of the two parshiot, we talk about Sarat. We start off talking about Sarat of the person. We then talk about Sarat of the clothing. We then talk about the means of purification of the person. And then we talk about the other topic of Sarat of the houses. So that if I take the two parshiot, as I said, as a unit, and they are a unit, the middle, the core, is talking about Sarat. And that's what I would like to talk about today. What is Sarat, and how do we understand it? And I want to actually begin by saying that 10 years ago, Pardes was very kind in giving me the opportunity and encouraging me to get a master's degree in teaching Tanakh. And I studied at the Herzog College in Alon Shvut. And then I had to do a master's paper to get my degree. So I actually did my paper on Sarat. But it really wasn't on Sarat. It was really on, the topic was an examination of 4 modern commentaries. And essentially, how do they take a topic which is so arcane, which is so unrelatable, and try to make it relevant? And I would imagine that for most of you out there, if not all of you, okay, when you read these 2 parshiot, and whether you go, I don't know how many people are capable of going to shul or hearing the Torah reading, given our current situation. But even so, it's a good idea to go through the parsha on Shabbat on your own. But when you'll read through it, I'm sure that many people will say to themselves, this is so weird, this is so strange, this is so technical, this is so boring. Why do I want to read this? So the point of my writing my paper at the time, and what I'd like to do this evening, is to try to show you how, in fact, studying these 2 parshiot may actually have very, very important ramifications even to today. And so what I'd like to do, and specifically we're going to be looking at Sarat. Okay, I would like to actually begin by saying the following. Generally, people, and I purposely didn't translate the word Sarat, because generally people refer to Sarat as leprosy. So I just want to put on the table right now, that translation of Sarat is actually something that comes from Christian commentators, which goes back way back, okay? And one of the things which I think will come out of this class is that Jewish commentaries had a very different understanding. And in fact, it might be that it's also based on a completely different understanding of what's going on over here. So before I start going into some sort of conceptual understanding of what's Sarat, I would first like to begin by just looking at what is called the classic case of Sarat, which appears in the beginning of chapter 13, Sarat of the body. And we're not going to go into extensive detail. We could spend a whole semester doing that. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to just go into enough detail to be able to develop certain ideas. So let's begin with chapter 13. I hope everyone has a chumash. And for those of you who don't have, so this will be the oral law for you. You'll just follow me. So the chapter begins as follows. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe v'el Aaron lemor. God spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Adam, ki yev va'or b'saro, se'et o sapachat o vaheret, v'haya va'or b'saro lenegat sara'at, v'huva el Aaron HaKohen, o el echad mibanav HaKohanim. So it says, if a man shall have, okay, on their skin, and then it describes these different things, se'et, sapachat, and baheret. And what I'd like to do is to bring you some rabbinic understandings as they appear in the Mishnah, as they appear in Midrashim, as they appear in the Talmud, that I think are essential over here. And I would also add that much of what I'm going to be doing is based on the idea that you can't really understand the text on a certain level without also seeing how the oral law understood it and how the oral law somehow complements what we have in the written law. So the first thing which I want to say is that when it says Adam kiyeva or besaro, a person, so the oral law says, first of all, Adam is telling me whether it's a man, whether it's a woman, these laws are applicable. But even more than that, it applies to anyone that I can call an Adam, although anyone here for the moment means someone who's Jewish, meaning the laws of Sarat would be applicable even to a one-day-old baby. Okay, and you'll see later on why this is going to be relevant. Now, what is this spot which they have on their skin? So the rabbis understood that, in fact, the classic spots that make one a Matsuura are 4 shades of white. Baheret, if you look at the pasuk, in Hebrew today, bahir means something which is clear. Baheret is seen as the clearest, purest form of white, the most intense form of white, and they say that's white as snow. Sa'at is white like the wool of a lamb. As you all know, Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. Mary had her little lamb. Her fleece was white as snow. So it's very interesting. I could give you a whole drash on that song, but I won't get into it now. But what you have is the most intense form is where it's white as snow. The next is where it is white as the wool of a sheep. And in fact, the rabbis say not just the wool of any sheep, but a wool of a sheep the day that it's born, which would be the most white that it is. And then each of those 2 categories has a subcategory. The subcategory of white as snow is what's called kisid hahechal, like the plaster of a ballroom, of a huge area. The subcategory of the wool is the white of the membrane surrounding the egg. So therefore, essentially what you have is 4 shades of white: snow, wool, white plaster, and the white of an egg. Anything which is not as white is not Sarat. And of course, anything which is a different color is not Sarat. Now, what else are we told in this verse? That when somebody has these white spots, you have to go to the Kohen, who will then examine it. And then if we look at verse 3, V'ra'a Kohen et nega ba'or basor, and the Kohen will now look at the nega, which, by the way, I want to say right now is a very important word. Throughout this section, Sarat is constantly being associated with another word, mega. And not only that, but the tractate in the Mishnah, which speaks about Sarat, is called Nigaim. And the word nega, for those of you who know Hebrew, is related to the word lingoa, which means to touch, which we will come back to. So what does it say? When the Kohen sees this, if he sees the spot, the se'ar banega hafach lavan, and the hair which is in that spot turned white, umarei hanega amok me'or besaro, and the appearance is deep in the skin. So then what we say is negat sara'atu. This is sara'at. V'ra'au kohen v'timeoto. And the priest will see him and he will declare him impure. But what happens? Before I get to what happens, let's look at the next verse. V'im ba'heret levanahi. If it's ba'heret, which we said is the most intense form, right? Ba'or b'saro, in his skin. V'amok ein mar'eha min ha'or. But it's not so deep. But what's even more important is usa'ara lo hafach lavan. The hair inside it did not turn white. V'isgira kohenet hanega shivat yamim. Then you have to lock up this person for 7 days. Today it's called quarantine, isolation. Okay? Now, actually, I'll just say this right now. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch is not so sure whether you actually have to lock up the person or whether it simply means you put them in isolation. But I'll come back to this in 1 second. Let's look at the next verse. V'ra'au kohen bayom hashvi'i, and then the priest will see him 7 days on the 7th day after he was locked up. V'hinei hanega amad be'inav. Right, the spot is still there. Lo fasa hanega ba'or, it didn't spread. V'hisgira kohen shivat yamim shenit. So he locks him up another 7 days. And then when we get to verse 6, V'ra'a kohen oto bayom hashvi shenit, so he then examines him once again on the 7th day of the period. V'hinei keha hanega. The nega is now dimmed. Lo fasa hanega ba'or, it didn't spread. V'tiharo kohen mispachati. So at that point, the priest will declare him pure, and then he's supposed to wash his garments, and he will be pure. Okay, washing your garments is not just washing your garments, it means ritual immersion. Not only do you have to do ritual immersion of the garment, you also have to do ritual immersion of the person, and there may be actually even more than that. Okay, but what I want to bring up is now the following. Or maybe let me, before I do that, just do one more verse. But what if after he was quarantined, this spot spread? Okay, after, right, he showed it to the Kohen for his purity. So he has to look at it a second time. Kohen, and the Kohen looks at it. He saw it spread. Kohen tsarati. So the priest declares him impure. So I want to begin with the following. In order for somebody to have tsarat, what's called the classic case of tsarat, you first of all have to have a white spot. It also has to be a certain minimum size. It's called a gris. Okay, it's probably the size of a dime, for those of you who are familiar with that. Okay, it not only does there need to be a white spot, but the hair inside it must turn white. And at that point, if you have both of those factors, the priest who examines you declares you a Matsuura. But what if you have the spot, but the hair did not turn white? So then we lock you up. Why do we lock you up? We lock you up because it's like this interim situation. We don't know, do you have it? Do you not have it? So we want to wait and see what happens in the next 7 days. So what do? On the 7th day, we check you. Now, if all of a sudden, right, the spot is still there, the hair turns white, you're declared a Matsuura. But what if the hair did not turn white? So what we do is we lock you up a second 7-day period. And then at that point, we have to now make a final decision, one way or the other. Now again, if the hair turned white, you're a Matsuura. What if it didn't? Well, but if it spread, That's another reason, so that after that period, you will now be declared a Metzora. Which means, in order to be declared a Metzora, you need a white spot. You need, in addition, either that the hair turns white, which is inside it, or if the hair didn't turn white, that after this period, these periods of waiting, that it's spread. You have a bigger spot than you originally did. At that point, you will be a Metzora. But if you had the white spot, and after 2 weeks, it didn't spread, the hair doesn't turn white, you're no longer a Metzora. Okay, everybody with me so far? Now, that has to do with, as I said, the classic case of Sarat and of becoming impure. By the way, okay, is there a situation where you're a Metzora, but there is no quarantine? Yes, there is a situation. Well, I'm going to get to that in 1 second. Okay, now what happens if you are an absolute Metzora, right? In other words, that we didn't have these 2 periods where you were quarantined, right? And by the way, the word in Hebrew is the hisgir. You close them up. So let's look at the end of chapter 13, and we'll look at verse 44. Actually, what I want to look at is verse 45. In verse 45, it says, V'hatzarua asher bo hanega, begadav yiyu frumim, v'rosho yiyeh farua, v'al safam yateh, v'tamei tamei yikra. And the person who has tzarat, who has this nega, his clothing, yufrumim, he has to tear them. Rosho yeh parua, he has to let his hair run wild. He's not allowed to cut it. V'al safam yateh, safam means his mustache, yateh means he covers it, which means, according to the rabbinic understanding, he has to place some sort of head covering over his face, and he has to also proclaim, announce to anybody around him, I am Tameh. Essentially to announce, I am a Metzora. Okay, well, we'll come to, I see some questions on the chat. Okay, yes, you're still a human being. We will talk about that. Now, let me just look at the next thing. Kol yemei asher hanega bo yitma. For the whole duration that you have this white spot, you are impure. Tamehu. Badad yeshev, alone you shall dwell. Michutz lamachane moshavo. Outside the camp will be your residence. So the first thing which I would like to bring up is the very last thing which I read. If someone is a Metzora, he needs to be sent outside the camp. Badad yeshev. Not only is he sent outside the camp, but he has to be alone. By the way, you should know that the rabbinic definition of being alone is that you don't have somebody come within your 4 cubits. For those of you who are not familiar with rabbinic measures, 4 cubits is approximately 2 meters. So for those of you who are familiar, at least in Israel, with the regulations about people keeping a distance of 2 meters, that already existed over here in terms of the Metzora, that when it says he's alone, it means nobody can come within his 4 cubits, 2 meters of him. Now, this idea of him being alone, being outside the camp, is whether he is what I called an absolute Metzora, absolutely definitive Metzora, or even in that interim period, which I mentioned earlier, the quarantine. He's also sent outside the camp, and he has to be alone. What's the difference between his status during that interim period And when he's decisively declared a Matsuura, it's only when he's decisively declared that he has to rip his garments, that he has to cover his face, that he has to also let his hair grow long, which means that even in the interim period, that person is fundamentally seen as being a Matsuura. Okay, this is the classic case of Matsuura. So now let me begin. Christian commentaries. Oh, I have a question here. Can you become pure again? Yes, you can become pure again. Okay, and that's essentially chapter 14, which discusses the whole process of becoming pure. The most fundamental requirement to become pure is that the spot has to disappear, although it's a little bit more complicated, which I'll mention in another few moments. But once the spot has disappeared, then you need to go through a whole purification process, which is essentially chapter 14. So let me begin with the following. Classic Christian commentaries on the Torah saw this section as being a model of what they called Jewish sanitary laws. And the general understanding of Christian commentaries throughout the ages was that Sarat is a physical disease which is known as leprosy. Today it's called Hansen's disease, okay, where you have these white spots. And the whole idea of going to the Kohen and the whole idea of declaring the person impure is for health, sanitary reasons. So that according to that interpretation, Sarat would be the forerunner of Corona. And in fact, according to this, right, we now have some type of disease, which we're extremely concerned is contagious. We need to have someone who's going to make the determination that this disease, okay, would, excuse me, for the people who are asking questions, you'll bear with me. Let me just get my bearings straight. Okay, so the idea being you have to go to the Kohen. The Kohen is the one who will make the determination. Is this really a disease? Is it not? Okay. Now I have a question from Lynn. Lynn, it's very nice to have you online. I should talk to you afterwards. Okay. So that means that this is presupposing that the Kohen is a doctor. And I'll just say this right now, this is something which is extremely disturbing to all the Jewish commentaries. Because all the Jewish commentaries say, where do we ever find that a Kohen is a doctor? Never. The Kohen is always seen as being a spiritual leader, as being somehow the go-between between us and God. So therefore, this is why they then see that how could this possibly have anything to do with a physical disease? But I want to just point out, to just finish up this point, so therefore, according to the Christian commentaries, this is why the Matsuura goes outside the camp. This is why he is isolated. He's all alone. Because we don't want the disease to spread. Now that is the classic, as I said, line of interpretation which you find in Christian commentaries. It's very interesting that among the classic Jewish commentaries, there are two commentaries, the Ibn Ezra and the Ralbag, who also try to see this as a physical ailment. And to the extent that the Ibn Ezra, who lived in the 1100s, also speaks about that the reason why he's sent outside the camp is because we don't want the disease to spread. But I want to point out that these two commentaries are really the exception to the rule of classic Jewish commentaries. And already from the rabbinic period, and when I speak about rabbinic period, I mean from the time of the Mishnah. Okay, we're talking about 2,000 years ago, plus. From already that period, you find that the rabbis have a completely different take on Sarat. And the basis for that is by actually looking at the Torah. Oh, by the way, before I get to the rabbinic interpretation, I actually discovered today for the first time, and I'm pretty old by now, but it was interesting that actually there's the classic Christian understanding may actually be then related to something which is an ancient Egyptian historian who's called Manetho, who actually has this whole theory that Moshe was an Egyptian priest who essentially put together a bunch of lepers and started a rebellion against Egypt, and that essentially the Egyptians kicked them out because they were just a colony of lepers. And then that could become the basis of saying, so from the whole beginning of the Jewish people, it seems that our whole origins was that we were a bunch of lepers, and that's why, okay, Sarat is such a big deal in terms of, Vayikra, that we have to deal with it, because this is something which is embedded in our whole national identity. By the way, you should know that the Jewish commentators, one of the reasons why they also challenge the idea of Sarat not being a physical disease is that, well, if it is a physical disease, so what about all the other physical diseases? What about all the other cancers that exist? So why don't you also take those and bring them to the Kohen? So why specifically is Sarat the one that's singled out? So just to be fair to the Christian side, so they'll say, well, because Sarat was really, the endemic to the Jewish people. And that's why we had to somehow rid ourselves of it, okay, in order to assume maybe a different persona. I don't know. But now I want to get essentially to the general Jewish understanding of Sarat. And the Jewish understanding is actually based by looking at examples from the Tanakh where Sarat appears. And the classic example is chapter 12 in the book of Numbers, in Bamidbar. And I'm sure that people are familiar with this. It's the story of Miriam. Miriam is speaking about her brother, about Moshe. Something that has to do with the fact that Moshe took this Cushite woman. And then at one point she says, did God speak only to Moshe? God also speaks to us. And then what you see in the continuation of the story is that God all of a sudden calls Miriam and Aaron and says, how could you possibly speak against Moshe? Don't you realize who Moshe is? Don't you realize that Moshe's level of prophecy is radically different, okay, than your prophecy? Moshe's prophecy, he speaks to God face to face. And for those of you who have the Chumash, so I'll just tell you, if you look in Bamidbar, in chapter 12, and specifically verse, just give me 1 second, we'll look at chapter 12, verse 10. After God tells off Miriam and Aaron, it then says, the cloud departed from the tent, and behold, Miriam is mitzorat kashelek. And therefore, what you have here are two things which I think become extremely important in the rabbinic understanding. The first thing is, Sarat is not just a natural disease. Sarat is actually the result of an act of God, a very clear act of God. And if I take this verse, Sarat is the expression of the presence of God which has left an individual. Because it says the cloud, which symbolizes the presence of God, leaves. And when the cloud leaves, Miriam is mitzorat kashelek. What else do we have there? When that happens, Aaron turns to Moshe and says, please. He says, pray on behalf of your sister. And if you look at verse 12, it says, Al na tehi kamet. Let her not be like one who is dead. And to me, that actually becomes the key. By the way, there's a rabbinic statement which appears in the Talmud that says that there are 4 people who are considered like being as one who is dead. One of them is a Matsuura, based on this pasuk. Nachmanides actually says in his commentary, on our parsha, chapter 13, verse 47, Nachmanides says that if the white spots is the color of a person who's dead, it's as if your vitality, right, has left you. The reason why your vitality has left you is because on a certain level, what is a dead person? A dead person is somebody whose soul has departed. God has left them. So that's essentially what's happening to the Matsuura. The presence of God on a certain level has left them, and now they have these white spots. It's a mini expression of death. And then the next thing which the rabbis say is, and why is it happening? And the rabbis say because Miriam was saying Lashon Hara. She was saying something negative about Moshe. And on that basis, the rabbis say that Sarat is a divine act which is punishing someone for the fact that they said Lashon Hara. I don't know how many people are actually familiar with this, but the first time in the Torah where Sarat actually appears. Anybody want to write it down in the chat? So the first time it appears is in chapter 4 in the book of Exodus, at the burning bush. And it appears when there's this whole discussion between God and Moshe, where Moshe is essentially given his mission to take the Jewish people out to negotiate with Pharaoh. And Moshe is saying, but I can't do it. And he has all kinds of issues. And then there's a certain point where Moshe says, and the Jewish people are not going to believe me. So God says to him, here, do this thing. Okay? You see your hand? Take your hand, put it inside your bosom. Now take it out. And lo and behold, Moshe's hand is mitzorat kashelek. And then God says, put it back in. And then it goes back to being normal. And Rashi quotes a midrash that says that God was kind of showing Moshe, how could you say the Jewish people won't believe you? How could you be bad-mouthing the Jewish people? Okay, and ask me after the shir about why not Aaron, why only Miriam. I'll talk about it after the shir. But right now, what I want to say is Moshe was bad-mouthing bad-mouthing the Jewish people, and therefore he's being punished now. His hand becomes leprous. Now, you find in a number of places in the Talmud and Midrashim that they actually expand it. And they say that it isn't just for saying Lashon Hara, but they expand it to a whole bunch of social sins, beyond social sins. So you have in one place it says for 7 things leprous, Sarat comes. In another place it says for 11 things it comes. Among the things it talks about not only saying Lashon Hara, for hubris, which they also see in the story of Miriam, because Miriam was equating herself with Moshe, which was presumptuous. And that's exactly what God is saying to her. How could you compare yourself to Moshe? Moshe is in a completely different league, but it's also based on some other stories that we have later on in the Tanakh. Then you have for theft, for idolatry, for sexual immorality, for taking a false oath. Lack of hospitality, it comes up actually by Sarat of the houses. By the houses, someone who doesn't open up their house, so their house gets Sarat. Okay? My point being that already in rabbinic literature, the rabbis see Sarat as not being just some type of disease, some natural phenomena, but they see this as being an expression of divine intervention, which is actually punishing someone for something that they've done which is wrong. Okay, now I just want to point out, I'll point out 2 things. First thing, but this is part of a whole other discussion, I'm not going to go into it right now. Every form of ritual impurity is actually connected with death. The classic model is a dead body. Sarat, as I tried to show you, is actually referred to also as death. Okay, death is essentially, like I said, when your soul departs, when in a certain sense the body has been disconnected from the divinity. So on some level, every form of ritual purity has connected with it the sense of being somehow detached, separated from God. Sarat is unusual. And what do I mean by that? Every other form of ritual purity happens automatically. Sarat is the only form of ritual purity where it's not like I have the spot and then automatically I become impure. I have to go to the Kohen. The Kohen has to declare me as being impure. And even in a situation where anybody, by any standard, would be able to clearly discern that here is a spot which is Sarat, you don't become impure until the Kohen declares you. Number 1. And number 2, Sarat is the only case of ritual impurity which the rabbis associate with a punishment. In no other form of ritual impurity do the rabbis see your impurity as being an expression of a punishment. So I want to just put in perspective that Sarat is something which is unique. Now, let me go back to how I began the shir. I said to you that whenever it speaks about Sarat, it says nega Sarat, where the word nega is very often translated as a plague. But in fact, the word nega in Hebrew is related to the word lingoa, which means to touch. And Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in his commentary says, essentially what it means is God is fingering you. And the whole reason for saying again and again, this is a nega, is a way of expressing the extraordinary nature of Sarat, that this is not something natural. This is supernatural. This is divine intervention. The same word nega appears in the context of the 10 plagues. In chapter 11, before Moshe is about to bring the last plague, God says to Moshe, Od nega echad avi al paro. The first time where the word nega appears is in chapter 12 of Breshit. When Abraham goes down to Egypt in a time of famine, and Pharaoh takes Sarah, God brings nigaim gdolim al paro. God brings great nigaim on Pharaoh. So the point is that the term nega in the Chumash is associated with something which is a direct expression of divine intervention. I would even say supernatural intervention. And that's what Sarat is. It's supernatural intervention. All the questions I'll come to after the class, so keep those questions in mind. But it's not just a punishment. It's a punishment which is actually educational. I see there are questions or comments that are coming. I will get to your comments. Just give me the opportunity. Okay? It's an education, and what do I mean by that? There's a very interesting comment which appears in the Tosefta. The Tosefta is what are called Brightot, the extensions of the Mishnah. Again, this goes back to the year 200, which says the following, that when the Kohen would declare the person as a Matsuura, he would say to the person, examine your ways. Think about what is happening to you right now. And then he would say, Sarat comes on a person because they said Lashon Hara. Sarat comes to a person because they were arrogant. If you change your ways, great. But if you don't, you will remain a Matsuura. Which means, according to this rabbinic understanding, part of the reason to go to the Kohen is because it's the Kohen who is the representative of God, who has that contact with God, who can now spot the hand of God acting upon that Matsuura. It's also the Kohen who is the spiritual guide, who's essentially saying to the person, God is bringing this upon you to educate you. Think about it. Learn from it. Change as a result of this. And if you do, you can bring about your own healing, which would then mean, so now I want to jump a little bit to Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch understands that the Sarat is a physical expression of a spiritual malady within the person. Okay, today, or not even today, many, many years ago, we talk about psychosomatic symptoms, about where people have all kinds of physical symptoms. But the root of those are really something which is psychological, right? You break out into a rash. Why do you break out into a rash? There isn't any real physical reason why that happened. It's more because you're under stress, which then causes, right, all kinds of hormones to then express themselves in having a rash. So he says Sarat is essentially what God is doing, is having a physical expression on the outside of your body, trying to point out to you that there is something wrong inside. It's an opportunity for a person, today we call it feedback, to get feedback. Hey, you should do a check-in with yourself. What's going on? According to this line of thinking, The reason why the Metzora is sent out of the camp is not because this is something contagious. The reason why he's sent out of the camp is either because he is somebody who has committed some type of social sin, which could be saying Lashon Hara, it could be stealing, which means he has behaved in a manner which does not make him fit to be living with other people. And if it isn't a social sin, but maybe because he's taken a false oath, he has desecrated God's name, which is another explanation that's offered. Maybe it's simply a method to isolate that individual, to enable them to now do very serious, what we would call introspection. We're not worried they're going to infect anybody. But what we do want is for them to be able to now reflect, for them to look at themselves very seriously, and to say to themselves, what is it that I have done? What is it that I need to correct? So come and essentially to do tshuva, which would therefore mean, according to this way of looking at it, Sarat is actually, I spoke about earlier being a punishment. In a certain way, Sarat is actually a blessing. Sounds kind of crazy, but it's a blessing because here it is. God is actually giving you feedback. God is somehow trying to show you there's something wrong with you, and here you have an opportunity to correct yourself. Everybody realizes that, in other words, when people get sick, that's actually good in a way, because it's feedback which your body is giving you that there's something wrong going on. And if you don't have, especially today, we're sensitive to that. If you don't have the symptoms, right, you don't even realize that there's something wrong until maybe, God forbid, it's too late. So that a lot of times getting sick, having a fever is good, because at least now you realize there's a problem, and now you can then begin to deal with it. In the case of Sarat, it's as if God is now imposing this thing upon you and telling you that the problem here is not a physical problem. The problem is a spiritual problem. And it's up to you, who should know yourself better than anyone else, to then think about, so what is your problem and how can you now correct that? Which therefore means that ultimately, when someone asked me earlier, how can you fix it? The answer is, the way that you fix it is to then try to transform yourself to being a different type of person, a better person, to then do tshuva. And according to this understanding, okay, tshuva would be the factor that would then lead to the spot going away and would then introduce the purification process. Quite a few commentaries say that even if somebody could make a case for the fact that Sarat is a physical sickness, but there is no physical parallel to Sarat of the clothing, to Sarat of the house. Even if we could find some type of physical disease which is similar to Sarat of the body, there is no parallel to Sarat of the clothing, Sarat of the house, and therefore they make the point of saying that those clearly are something which is part of a supernatural reality. I would even add the following, which Ramban Nachmanides says. He says that Sarat of the houses is actually only applicable in the land of Israel. And it only applies when the Jewish people are actually having a close relationship with God, which, if you then took that even further, would be saying that the whole concept of Sarat, as it is in the Tanakh, is presupposing that God is very much active and involved in our reality. But the moment that God is further removed from our reality, then we don't have Sarat anymore. And the logic would be because the further God is removed, the more God is not going to intervene and give us feedback. As I said, this is not only the classic rabbinic way of understanding, this is the way that the overwhelming majority of Jewish commentaries have understood it. I would even add that Professor Jacob Milgram, who was a scholar who passed away 10 years ago, a conservative rabbi who was a professor in Berkeley and in Hebrew University, also subscribes to the idea that Sarat is not a physical disease. He even quotes, right, a dermatologist who is a very close friend of his, who said to him, right, there is nothing, if you look at all the things which are described by Sarat, there's nothing which we have that we are aware of that in any way is comparable to it. And he also comes to the conclusion that this is something which is very unique, which is a clear act of God intervening in the world. Since my time is running out, so I would just like to end with something which Professor Milgram writes at the end of his commentary on Sarat. He quotes a student of his who by the name, his name is Wright, I imagine is not someone who is Jewish, who then made a comment which I think is very appropriate for today. He said that people have to be extremely careful to not extrapolate from what the Torah talks about to our reality, to not make automatic associations. And what's he concerned with? What he's concerned with is, well, if you say Sarat is actually an expression of God intervening, and God who's now bringing about some sort of punishment, and it's a punishment and the person is now, has done something, whatever it is. So maybe I'll now go and say, so when I now see somebody who has cancer or AIDS or corona and say to them, oh, you know why this is happening? God is making it happen, and God is making it happen in order to punish you. And the other day, somebody even told me, I didn't hear it myself, somebody said to me, but I don't see it being so out of the question that some rabbi or so-called rabbi tried to give an explanation of why corona is happening and said, well, corona is happening because of the immodesty which is going on in the streets. And so first of all, I don't know necessarily what the connection is between the two, but doesn't matter. So I just want to say two things about that and to end with it. The first thing is that even according to the interpretation which I presented to you, and if I come back to this Tosefta, which says that when the priest would declare someone as a Matsuura, he would say to him, start thinking about what you've been doing, why this is happening. But even in that context, it's ultimately the person himself who has to draw the conclusions. It's not the Kohen who's going to say to that person, right, this is happening because I know you did X, Y, and Z. Who are you to tell that person why it's happening? Only that person themselves can draw whatever conclusions they can draw. So I think in general, that's an extremely important thing. That even if I were to see whatever it is as being somehow an act of God, but maybe it should be left to the person who's going through that experience and does the soul searching to say, why is this happening? By the way, We find by the book of Job, when Job's friends start telling Job, oh, well, maybe this is happening because maybe you did this or maybe you did that God is extremely upset with them. Who are you to be telling Job why this is happening to him? And the second thing which I want to say, which also appears in the Midrashim, is that, remember I said to you before that when the person is declared a Matsuura, the person has to then declare to everybody, right? Go with a sign. I am a Matsuura, I am Tameh. Now, if I were to ask you, well, why does he have to publicize it, right? It says he has to call out, I am Tameh, I am Tameh. So the obvious answer would be because he's trying to tell people, stay away from me, right? I don't want to infect you. But that's not how the rabbis understand it. And even if it wasn't a question of infection, right? Because the rabbis don't see it as a disease, a physical disease that's contagious. But if it's a question of just trying to make sure they don't become ritually impure, the rabbis say, why does he call out and tell them he's tameh? So that they should now be mevakesh rachamim alav. So that they should ask for God's mercy on that person. Which means that according to this rabbinic understanding, the people who see the Matsuura, rather than shunning the Matsuura, should feel empathy for the Matsuura. They should pray for his well-being. They should try to pray for the fact that he should be healed. And I think that that becomes an extremely important message to us. Okay, that in other words, that when we see people who are in difficult situations, rather than all of a sudden say, well, you deserve it, you're getting what's coming to you, right? I know why this is happening. People should do everything which they can to be empathetic and to really pray for the well-being of all those who are ill. So on that note, I would like to say that, in other words, we are certainly experiencing a very difficult situation of a pandemic. I think the last thing that we should do is to see this as being an act of God which is punishing us and then start drawing all kinds of conclusions as to, who's responsible, right? And who's acting immorally and bringing this upon us. On the other hand, what I would say two things. The first thing which I would say is that we should have tremendous empathy for all the people who are sick and pray for their well-being. And the second thing which I would say is, because I do believe that things that happen in the world don't just happen, but ultimately, right, happen with, whether it be that God brought it about or God wanted it to happen, to say to ourselves, so what is it that I can learn from this experience? How can I become a much better person as a result of this experience? Okay, and maybe it's true that maybe when we experience being in isolation and not being able to socialize, maybe that can be something that we can use as a way of valuing our relationships much more. Maybe as what's happening right now, because of what's happening, right, all of a sudden we have online classes to be able to connect people who want to be connected but haven't gone about doing it. So I think that on the one hand, we should be empathetic to those who are sick, and on the other hand, from all the experiences that we have, it is important to think about what are we going through and how can we become much better people as a result of this experience. Shabbat Shalom to everyone, Chodesh Tov, and let's hope that this Chodesh, and I would also say that next week we are celebrating the anniversary of the State of Israel, which for many people, including myself, is an expression perhaps of a certain redemption process that we should hope that we should all experience in this month of redemption, a redemption which will take us out of our isolation and bring us back, okay, to where we should be and where we should be maximizing who we are. Shabbat Shalom. For those of you who would like to stay on and have questions, so I'll stay on for a little bit longer. We'll wait for people to go out and then we'll open it up.
Okay. Mayor, I don't know how you do this. Thank you.
Rabbi, hello from Los Angeles. And you were going to answer questions and talk about Aaron, why he didn't get Sarat.
What? About why Aaron didn't get Sarat? Okay, so the answer, which generally is, well, first of all, I just want you to know that there actually is one midrash that says that he actually did. It's not in the text. There is a midrash that says he did.
Don't call me back tonight.
But
I'll try to reach you tomorrow.
the second, but what would be probably the better answer would be that Miriam was actually the driving force behind it. Because the whole section begins, Vatidaber Miriam, that Miriam spoke, brought Aaron into it. And so that to a certain extent, because she is what you might call the instigator, so she's the one who bears the brunt of it. Now, you could still say that Aaron was kind of participating in it, and Aaron didn't stop it. Then on some level, okay, he should be punished as well. Your question is probably better than the answer that I can give you. But I think the only answer which I have is because she is the one who is seen as being the driving force. Anyone else? Questions, comments?
Yeah.
Mayor? Okay.
Yeah, who's Hanan?
Yeah. So in Masechet Nagayim, right? I think it's like 10 chapters or something like that.
Correct, yeah.
There's not one mention, I don't think, of why Sarat comes. I mean, it's all about the details of what to do. But if
You're absolutely right.
Why do the rabbis don't want to talk about this thing about what's going on?
No. So I think that has to do with the perception of, okay, by and large in the Mishnah, you don't go into the quote unquote the philosophy of something.
Not one Mishnah, something
what?
At the end?
What?
Not like one line, something at the end. Sometimes there's a little bit of.
Okay, so again, Hanan, if I didn't have it appear in any rabbinic literature, I would agree with you. But first of all, as I mentioned to you, in the Tosefta, they already speak about when the Kohen declares him a Matsuura, about he introduces the idea of why it's happening. So it does appear in the Tosefta. And I think it's important to see the Tosefta as a complement to the Mishnah. It certainly appears in the Talmud, and it appears in other midrashic literature, which essentially is from the same time period. So I don't know how much I would put on the fact that it doesn't appear in the Mishnah, since I think the focus of the Mishnah was very much to focus on the focus of the Mishnah were the details of and then we have other literature from the same period, which might be giving you more of the spiritual side to it.
Okay.
Yes, Moshe.
So you mentioned that whereas leprosy is contagious, Sarat was not contagious. However,
okay, so Moshe, let me just say, that was the Christian understanding. What's fascinating is, in the late 1800s and subsequently, they started coming to the conclusion that leprosy itself was not contagious.
but I wouldn't even want to speak about leprosy. I want to speak about Sarat, and Lashon Hara is definitely contagious. So if the cause of Sarat is contagious, if Sarat itself is not.
Okay, so I think what you're saying would again be the reason for why you would isolate this person. Because what you're saying is, right, now you're now doing something, right, which is going to infect spiritually other people. I agree 100%.
Exactly. Thank you.
The same
A
thing is
pleasure.
true. The same thing is true of inhospitality and of idolatry, of the other categories of Sarat.
You're right. And it's this I didn't go into, but in terms of Sarat of the house, Carol, it's wonderful to see you.
Likewise.
In terms of Sarat of the house, so there is also a comment which says that if a person has a house which is potentially Sarat, so or is Sarat, so what they would do is the Kohen would come and tell the person to take out everything from the house before they would then start, taking it apart, right, as part of. So now one interpretation is that the reason why you clear out the house beforehand is so that all the things in the house don't become impure before he declares it. But the other interpretation is the reason why you clear it out is actually a punishment in a way, because we're talking about a person who, when people would come to them and say, can I borrow something? And they would say, I'm really sorry, but I don't have it. And then all of a sudden now his house gets Sarat, and then you start emptying it out, and then everybody sees, oh, it's really interesting. I thought you didn't have this thing over here. So then that would be, the other side of the coin.
Rabbi, you mentioned earlier a baby, but they never went into it.
Correct.
How is a baby born with Sarat? How, unless they believed more in reincarnation back then, a baby hasn't had time to have Lashon Hara or any other defects of that sort.
Okay, so you should know that Hirsch in his commentary says that, and that's why I mentioned it, but I didn't go into it in the shir. So he says that the case of the baby ostensibly would actually undermine this whole explanation. Because he says, if you want to say that, right, this is a kind of punishment, it's a kind of education, right, to the person, but what does that mean to a baby? Okay, so the way that he interprets it is that he says that when it happens to the baby, it's actually a message to the father. And then Moshe, if I take what you were saying, right, on a different level, what he's saying is like, you have a problem. And now your baby has this tzarat because your problem is how you're going to bring up your baby. And you're going to infect your baby with all of your baggage. So like now look at your baby and now think about, how you might be impacting on that baby, so that if you don't want to do it for your own sake, do it for the sake of, the family that you're raising right now. So that what's happening to the baby is, again, in other words, it's meant to be a message to the parent of look at what you are going to be doing to your child.
Isn't that a punishment unto the 4th generation, the 10th generation?
Okay, but again, you're right. But again, if I don't see the tzarat as being a punishment, and if I don't see it as being a punishment, which is going to be a stain on, but that there's the corrective. So then the question is, and again, by the way, I think of this, if we weren't talking about tzarat, but will we be talking about something else? I think it would all have the same message. How much the parents realize the negative baggage which a lot of times they give to their children. And what does it take for parents to realize, right? Like, I don't know, take smoking. You could take all kinds of examples, right? In other words, do you realize that when you're doing this, how you're affecting those around you? And so even if you don't care about, or you think that for you it's okay, but care about those around you. Okay, and again, think about it, Moshe, what you brought up, I think is a great example, right? You have people who, who talk Lashon Hara, right? And then their kids grow up, right? That this is the norm and this is, what we always do. That's how we spend Friday night dinner. And so then what have you done? In other words, it's not just what you're doing. It's like, what's the home environment that you've created? And therefore, there becomes a whole issue about how do I then, maybe say, if not for my sake, but at least for my children's sake, I'll behave differently. So that's his take on it.
At least you can get out of this one, unlike.
And you can get out of it. And see, this, I think this becomes actually the important point over here. It's not like now that you have the Sarat, forevermore you will have Sarat, okay? But the idea being that, in other words, it's in your hands. You created it, but on the contrary, you also have the ability, and that's why that statement that I mentioned to you about the Kohen is so important. The Kohen is saying to the person, I'm now declaring you a Matsuura. But I want you to know that in others, but you have the ability to get yourself out of this. So do it. It's really in your hands.
So is the only way to get out of it having the white spots disappear?
That yes. Okay, by the way, you should know that the other way, which is fascinating, is that what happens if you have a situation, right, where somebody had the white spots, and then remember I said to you, so, did they disappear? Did they not disappear? But then I didn't quote you this pasuk. But what happens if all of a sudden it really spreads and you become completely white from head to toe? So then you know what happens? If you actually, if you have your Chumash in front of you, look at chapter 13, verse 13. Or actually even before that, 12 and 13. What happens if this Sarat, right, has spread all over the person's body from head to toe, wherever you can see it? So now if you look at the end of verse 13, it says, Kulo hafach lavan, he turned completely white, tahorhu, he's pure. Now, that's completely counterintuitive. If you come completely white, so that means you're completely infected. So why would we want to then say he's pure? And in effect, he's not isolated. He goes back into society. Now again, this pasuk certainly doesn't make any sense if you're talking about a contagious disease. If somebody is completely white and you see this being contagious, why would you now say he's pure and then go back into society? So you know what the understanding of the rabbis is?
No.
If you become completely white, what it means is you're incorrigible. You have no possibility of doing tshuva. So then what's the point of isolating you? I'm going to have you go back into society, and here, in terms of what people were asking, you will remain white all the time. It will never go away. It's like you have this mark on you, right? Which means on the one hand, you're going to be part of society, but on the other hand, you're going to be on a certain level shunned by society because everybody will see you're totally white and what's wrong with this guy? But the idea that he became... What?
Doesn't that go against the idea of free will, where you could always change? You could always do tshuva?
So this is part of a much larger discussion, but Maimonides, when he talks about the laws of tshuva, says that, and he spends a lot of time talking about tshuva, about repentance. He says at one point that there are certain times when people do certain things where they've put themselves beyond the point of doing tshuva, which means that those are extremely exceptional cases, but Maimonides allows for the possibility, right? That in other words, that it could be that there are certain situations where people put themselves beyond the point of tshuva, right? I mean, to me, when I read that thing of Maimonides, the thing which immediately comes to my mind was Eichmann at the Eichmann trial, where when you look at how he is sitting through this trial, doesn't flinch, doesn't bat an eyelash, in no way expresses any type of remorse any type of sympathy to the people who've been killed. And the only thing is, well, I was just a cog in the machinery. So what does that say? Like something that could say, you know what? I apologize. I'm sorry. So yes, there are some situations where there are people who are beyond doing tshuva. And therefore Maimonides actually says that people should not take tshuva for granted, but should see tshuva as being an opportunity, being a gift. Okay? By the way, I want to just say this, beyond that. I imagine everybody could, see in your own day-to-day life, right? And we're all not angels, right? And we all have things that we could be doing better. And there are certain things where people, right? And everybody, I think, for whatever reason, keep on doing the same mistake again and again and keep on saying to themselves, I'm going to do it differently, okay? And don't. And at a certain point, people also give up and say, well, that's just who I am. I've heard plenty of people who say that. That's who I am, and it's not going to change. So it means that the person has already kind of written off for themselves the possibility of changing. I mean, that's why I think this whole idea that you have over here by the Sarat is so powerful, because what it's doing is saying to the person, right? You have an opportunity. It's staring in your face. Take advantage of it. And in the end, it's your decision which way it's going to go. And the question is, how much do people take themselves seriously? Okay.
Yeah.
I have a
Any
question.
last question?
I
Yeah.
have a question.
Yes, Shana.
Do we know of anybody other than Miriam who contracted Sarat?
Yes, we definitely do. If you look later on in Tanakh, and I was debating, but I didn't have enough time to be able to do it. You have a few examples of it. There is a Syrian general whose name is Naaman. If you want to look this up, I'll give you the reference.
Okay.
It's in Kings 2. Kings 2, chapter 5, verses 1 through 19. It's a story of a Syrian general, and if you actually read the story, I'll give you the punchline a little bit, who's a very pompous guy, very accomplished, and he has leprosy. And nothing in the world is going to cure him of it. And then all of a sudden, there's this Jewish maid that his wife has, who tells him, well, there's this prophet in Israel. Why don't you go to him? He can help you out. And he goes to the prophet Elisha, and essentially Elisha kind of snubs him. But he says, you know what? If you want to, get rid of your leprosy, go dip in the Jordan 7 times. And he then starts going and saying, the Jordan River, right? If you want me to go to these, spas or, special, mineral baths, like in Syria, they have much better rivers than the Jordan. Why would I do the Jordan? And then they say to him, well, what do you got to lose? So he finally does it. But there was an educational message. You know why he told him the Jordan? Because the Jordan actually isn't impressive. And get off your high horse. That's why he snubbed them. You think you're God's greatest gift to humanity. And therefore, the whole point was, it was a humbling experience. And when he actually was humbled, that's when his purification came about. There's another story about another fellow called Gehazi, okay, who was also Elisha's servant. And that's actually the next story, or it's connected with the Naaman story. And there they say because he did a desecration of God's name. So he became leprous, not only him, but his children afterwards. And then there's a king, okay, Uzziah, who became leprous. So Miriam is not the only example. There are other examples that come up later. And based, by the way, the rabbis, based on each story, says, well, if I look at what happened in that story, so that gives me the reason. So in the case of Naaman, it's arrogance. In the case of Gehazi, it's the desecration of God's name. Okay? In another story, okay, it had to do with also some type of hubris. So Miriam is definitely not the only example.
Thank you.
Okay, by the way, if you look, if for those of you who are interested, you should also look at another verse, which is in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 24, verses 8 and 9.
Say that again, please.
Deuteronomy, Dvarim,
Uh-huh.
chapter 24, verses 8 and 9.
Okay.
So there it says, beware, right? Guard yourself against Sarat. And then in the next verse it says, and remember what God did to Miriam.
Right.
Which means that the juxtaposition of these two verses, so the first verse is talking about beware of Sarat in general. And then what it's saying is, and look at what happened to Miriam. So the Torah itself is telling me, if you want to know what Sarat is all about, look at the story of Miriam, and that will give you the answer. So it's not by chance that the rabbis saw Sarat, the story of Miriam as being the type, right? And in a certain sense, the key to understanding what Sarat is. Okay, one last question if anybody has.
Shlomo Carlebach used to call that the headquarters. The headquarters of the text.
Yeah, fair. Okay, everyone, have a Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov, and I hope that we will be doing this on a regular basis.